Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 7 of the Garrote podcast. I am your host, Chingachgook, and I am once again in studio with my co-host, Mr. Howard Roark. So, today is going to be yet another interesting episode, because what I want to talk about today is something that I myself have found to be particularly recurrent when attempting to engage in discourse with what I will temporarily refer to as the uninitiated. Those individuals who are unfamiliar with the terms and parlance of what we are trying to unpack in this podcast. The principal term that we need to wrestle with is a term that is called the Epistemic Card. Now, problems of vocabulary aside, I have oftentimes run into issues where when I say the word epistemic or when I say the word epistemology, people don't understand what I'm talking about. They'll say, what does that word mean? And these are people who, for some reason, could not be bothered to pull out their phone and go to dictionary.com. So, for the sake of abundant clarity, epistemic is the adjective form of the noun epistemology, which is a subdivision of philosophy specifically concerned with the study of knowledge. That's how it's usually defined.
What does it mean to know something? How do you know that you know what you know?
Correct.
So the word epistemology is centered around the question, how do you know?
Correct. The Gideon case is about the farmer who goes out into the field and sees a distant black plastic bag stuck in a tree, and the farmer concludes that his cow is in the field, but he never actually saw his cow, but unbeknownst to the farmer, the cow was laying down in the field behind the plastic bag. And so the question is, did the farmer actually know that his cow was in the field? These are thought experiments and philosophical questions that are stereotypically associated with the study of epistemology.
For what we're concerned with, the question at hand has a lot to do with how do you answer the question, how do you know, when the question, how do you know, is posed to you.
Correct. So for today, I actually have a provisional definition of the epistemic card. And so what I'd like to lead with is submitting my working definition and seeing if it withstands scrutiny. If it fails to withstand scrutiny, what needs to be adjusted to make it more complete?
Okay.
What needs to happen in order to make it sufficient if the working definition as it stands right now does not meet the necessary threshold of adequacy?
Okay.
So provisionally, I define the term epistemic card as a pathological form of rebuttal that seeks to reject a given proposition by appealing to uncertainty regarding descriptive claims. And so at this point, I want to take a moment to address the audience. One of the key terms within this definition is descriptive claims. We talk about descriptive claims and normative claims a lot on this podcast, and we use these terms from their textbook definitions, which is why I don't include the terms descriptive claims and normative claims in the corpus of what we're trying to build out on this podcast. For the sake of providing sufficient curation for our audience sitting at home, I have pulled up here a very short and brief paragraph explanation of the distinction between descriptive and normative. For those of you sitting at home who are not familiar with the study of formal philosophy and the terms that arise out of that, this is just something that I randomly Googled. It's called criticalthinkeracademy.com. Their description of the difference between descriptive and normative, it's a little comical, but it gets the job done for right now, so I'm just going to read it for the sake of the audience sitting at home. So, descriptive versus normative claims. A claim itself is a statement that asserts something that could be either true or false. A descriptive claim is a claim that asserts that such and such is the case. A normative claim, on the other hand, is a claim that asserts that such and such ought to be the case. Normative claims make value judgments. Descriptive claims do not make value judgments. Examples of descriptive claims would be, the mug of coffee in front of me is now at room temperature, or I had toast and eggs for breakfast this morning, or Kevin is under 6 feet tall. These are all descriptive claims. They make no value judgments. Examples of normative claims would be, that was a really stupid thing to do, or if you wanted to pass that test, you should have studied harder, or your electrocardiogram test results are normal, or even, the state should not have the right to take the life of one of its citizens as punishment for a crime. These are all examples of normative claims. Each one of them expresses a value judgment of some kind. However, only the last one expresses a moral claim. The others express different kinds of non-moral normative values and make different kinds of normative judgments. It's a little juvenile, but it's enough to get the job done here, which then allows us to return to the provisional definition that I have of the term epistemic card, specifically regarding the clause talking about appealing to uncertainty regarding descriptive claims. So that would be, I had milk and toast for breakfast, or the coffee is now at room temperature. A simple description of something that is or is not the case, and these propositions, these claims could either be true or false.
So there are a couple things that I would like to look at with this definition. First of all, when we are referring to the epistemic card, we're not always referring to a form of pathology. It can be pathological, and it can be problematic, and I see what you're accounting for. The card part of the epistemic card is referring to a strategy. So rather than a pathological form, saying a strategy.
Let me see if I can account for what I suspect you are trying to account for with the following commentary. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think you're getting at is those instances where acknowledging epistemic uncertainty is actually the proper thing to do. There do exist instances where it is appropriate to acknowledge and appeal to epistemic uncertainty.
Yes, which would make it not pathological.
Exactly right, as is inherent in the term appropriate. So I would take those instances and I would remove those from the term epistemic card, and instead I would use an alternative term to refer to those appropriate instances of epistemic appeals by using the term epistemic problem. So the epistemic card and an epistemic problem are not the same thing.
We have epistemic, which is the question of what does it mean to know something. And then the card, which is what I would refer to as a strategy. It might be a slight improvement to say a pathological strategy rather than a pathological form, but that's a minor improvement at best. It's not something you have to do, but it's something that people do in order to try and derail an argument, and they do it in a very strategic way when this is indeed pathological. Rejects a proposition by appealing to the uncertainty of the descriptive claims of the proposition.
One of the most common iterations of such a pathological form of rebuttal would be the phrase, well, you don't know that.
I see. I would like for something in the definition to point to what is pathological about that kind of a response, but...
Well, that's what we need to unpack in this episode.
I'm looking at descriptive claims and I'm wondering if that's precise enough, but we can keep this for now. It's not quite where I want it, but I'm not exactly sure how I want to rearrange it yet, so I think I want to come back to it. Unless we need this nailed down in order to do more.
Well, I don't know.
Let's try to do the next thing and see if it fails.
The next thing that follows from such a definition is to unpack the reason, why is the epistemic card pathological? Why is the epistemic card a problem? Why is the use of the epistemic card immediate grounds to reject, suspect, whatever the opponent's rebuttal is?
Well, you said reject a given proposition.
Right. So this is a situation where you, the individual presenting the proposition for scrutiny, then comes up against the epistemic card. Why is it that the epistemic card does not undermine the original claim in the way that the person who uses the epistemic card hopes that it will do? Because the epistemic card is used by individuals who have no rebuttal, who have no counterargument, who have no ability to articulate what the counterproposal would be, or have no ability to falsify or to declare the truth value of the claim that you're making. That is false because X, Y, Z. They cannot do that, so they pull out the epistemic card by appealing to uncertainty by saying, well, you don't know that. So although I cannot claim the negative form of the proposition, you cannot claim the positive form of the proposition either, so we're both left knowing nothing. In that way, it is pathological because it destroys the ability to advance inquiry and to advance a position, but to leave it at that is a problematic tiger move. It's more than just an inability to advance discourse or advance a position. It's deeper than that.
Something very convenient about the epistemic card is that it instantly ends the conversation without having to do any work. And it doesn't allow for additional valuable work to be done with regards to the discussion, because it just ends the discussion. Basically trying to create a situation where one person is saying if they can't be right, then no one can be right. So everyone gets pulled into the void of chaos and uncertainty as a result of my inability and unwillingness to put the work into actually asking the question of what's better and how do I generate the best option out of the chaos before me. It's a very childish thing to do, but I've seen adults do this. Old children doing it.
But dismissing it as a childish thing to do is a very problematic tiger move.
I agree. So people have no rebuttal, they have no argument, they have no response. And the appeal to saying, well, you don't know that, which is what we're calling the epistemic card. Playing the epistemic card gives that individual some kind of an advantage, despite that advantage being short-sighted. It's not supposed to matter that you don't know something with epistemic certainty, often because these lines of inquiry are trying to establish what we refer to as provisional positions, which don't require epistemic certainty because they operate in the realm of hypothetical.
Well, let's do this. The epistemic card, we must be very clear, has a number of different forms. It is more than just the claim, well, you don't know that. That is merely one of the forms that the epistemic card can take, albeit it is arguably among the most common, if not the most common form, in what I have personally observed. However, a very close second to that form is the alternative form that claims differing sources of information. Now, the reason why this form, I would argue, is slightly less common than the, well, you don't know that form, is that this second form, I call it the news form, really can only take place in a situation where the subject at hand has to do with something beyond the realm of, let's just call it day-to-day individual experience. So whatever you would see on the news, as an example. So this would be a situation where you have a proposition P, to use academic philosophy shorthand, P just being a contraction of the form proposition. It can be anything. And in this case, it's usually a descriptive claim. So Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, or the Eiffel Tower is in Antarctica, or what have you. It doesn't matter. So you have some proposition P. And then generic individual number one declares proposition P on the basis of some variety of news source. And then generic individual B looks at generic individual A and says, well, not P. the opposite of P because there's this other news source that declares the exact opposite. So P and not P being the academic philosophy shorthand references to two claims that cannot be true at the same time. They are mutually contradictory. So an example would be the Eiffel Tower is in Paris versus the Eiffel Tower is in Antarctica. Both of these propositions cannot be true at the same time. It's possible for them both to be false, but they definitely cannot both be true. In this way, they are mutually contradictory in terms of their true truth value. So this gives rise to what I call the magic TV problem. Now, the magic TV problem is in itself just a hashtag of a children's fairy tale about this little gnome or elf that lives in this hole in the wall. And the idea is that there's this member of his family that lives in the house, and depending on who looks inside the hole in the wall, they see a different version of the elf. So the mom sees that the elf is very docile and kind, and the dad sees that the elf is very aggressive and violent or whatever. So the magic TV problem is basically a modernization of this tale, where you have this TV, this television set, and you have this group of people sitting around in the room. At the exact same time, while the TV is on, the people in the room are seeing completely different things on the TV screen. So one person sees the news, another person sees cartoons, another person sees MTV music videos, another person sees an HBO drama, whatever. It doesn't really matter. But the bottom line is that you have this TV set that's going in the middle of a room, and you have all these people watching the same exact TV at the same exact time, and they are all observing completely different, unrelated things. So, in the context of that thought experiment, the question then arises, okay, so then what is actually on the TV? How do you mediate the question of what is on the TV when everybody who is looking at the TV sees something completely different? This is, in essence, the story behind what is called the magic TV problem, which in turn is a thought experiment to represent what is inherently an epistemic problem. How do you negotiate and dialogue with individuals who look at what's supposed to be the same exact thing and see completely different things? Because suddenly the ability to have a common form of reference is gone. There's nothing to reference commonly anymore. So what do you do in that situation? This is where our term of provisional positions comes into play. We work around it. The idea of the provisional position being, we're not going to talk directly about what is on the TV. It's a black hole, like dark matter. It's this really twisted situation where what is supposed to be objectively observable in a very thumb-down sense in the world suddenly becomes the unobservable.
Okay.
So how do you negotiate and discourse with other people without being able to have that common form of reference? The provisional position being based upon the hypothetical of, if this, then what would be concluded? If that, then what would we conclude?
If this was the situation, then what would you do?
Correct. And so the provisional position, although this is not an adequate definition of the term provisional position, what it does in its function is to get around the epistemic card.
Right.
To be able to say in response, well, you don't know that. Well, I don't need to.
I'm not talking about what I definitely do or don't know with epistemic certainty. I'm saying if the conditions are this, then my position would be that. I don't need to know if these are the actual conditions or not. I'm saying, should these conditions be the case, this is what my position would be.
And for those musicians at home listening in, one of the internal metaphors that I use for the process of describing something like provisional positions would be relative pitch, as opposed to perfect pitch. Well, how do you know that's C? I don't need to. Assuming that that is C, I can map out all the other scale degrees in relation to whatever the given is. And if I need to move, I can, but that doesn't mean I lose the entire structure.
It's a point of reference.
And that's something that I have observed repeatedly when trying to deal with the uninitiated and dialogue with the uninitiated, where the uninitiated are so fixated on perfect pitch that their fixation on perfect pitch creates a situation where if you undo the reliability of a single pitch, the entire melodic structure crumbles around them. And the uninitiated have no concept of relative pitch. The idea that we can forget about notes and just default to scale degrees for the time being. And guess what? Scale degrees in solfege will get us really far. And then we can tie it down to whatever the specific pitches need to be at a later time.
Well, you don't need to know what the notes are.
Eventually we will. That doesn't mean that knowing the notes is unimportant, but not knowing the notes doesn't stall progress. And what that means is that by building out the entire structure of music based around relative pitch, based around intervals and scale degrees, you can create entire logical structures that we like to call music without having to know what the actual pitches are up front from the beginning.
Well, you don't need to know what key you're in.
That doesn't mean that there is no key. That doesn't mean that it's impossible to determine what the key is. But again, like what I'm saying with this analogy, we can tie the structure of the music to whatever key we need as soon as we can actually get our hands on something that is epistemically tangible. As soon as we get our hands on a tuning fork, for example. Just because we don't have a tuning fork doesn't mean that everything stops. We can have music without the tuning fork, and then when we get the tuning fork, we'll do the adjustments as needed at that time. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that it's not clear to me how to take that music analogy that makes perfect sense in the context of music theory and apply it to something like positions on an intellectual topic or a question, or building out a worldview or a position on any sort of given question.
Mm-hmm. Just for a little bit of breaking down some of this. So relative pitch is the ability to measure from a point of reference. So the relativity is very much contained within a defined scope. I want to back up a little bit to when you were talking about the TV. So I want to phrase some of this back to you and then correct me where I go astray. Because there are a couple of different ways to interpret the description that you were making of this TV. What's curious to me is the ambiguity around whether or not the TV is displaying the same pattern of colors to everyone. So the magic part of the magic TV, I'm assuming, is that it's a different pattern of colors that's being displayed to different individuals. But what we're talking about is the unreliability of a common form of reference, particularly when everyone is trying to look at what they think is the same thing. So is the magic TV problem simply the axiom that states common ground is required to proceed with the discussion?
The reason why I'm looking at that axiom with shifty eyes is the phrase common ground, because the phrase common ground in modern English parlance is something of a cliche. So my intuition is telling me that the adequacy of that axiom stands or falls upon how the term common ground is defined.
Okay. You were also referring to this problem where an individual gets, as you said, fixated on perfect pitch, which is basically a fixation on the ability to describe what is observable by the senses.
At the very least, it's an ability to agree upon what is the state of reality. I'm reminded of a lot of the really idiotic urban legends and my experience of observing individuals who take these sorts of urban legends seriously. I remember back to my childhood encountering claims that, for example, Paul McCartney is dead, and the person who the world understands to be Paul McCartney is actually a decoy, and that the real Paul McCartney died decades ago. Or alternatively, that Elvis Presley is still alive. These are very thumbed-down claims that are very subject to falsifiability. They are either true or false. They cannot be true or false at the same time. Their opposites are mutually exclusive. But if you are talking with someone who does not agree with what the nature of reality is, how one ought to proceed is not clear, and that's what has given rise to things like the epistemic card. That is what has given rise to things like provisional positions. That provisional position is supposed to operate as a tool to enable the individual to proceed with those with whom there is no consensus about the nature of reality. With Paul McCartney or Elvis Presley being alive or dead being very juvenile thumb-down examples. But you can see how very quickly something like this scales.
Well,
9/11 was an inside job. Pick whatever.
Well, some examples would be helpful. So in the case of something like Elvis is still alive, just to pick one of those examples.
Let's do a spectrum. We'll do low, middle, and high. So the low example would be that Elvis Presley is still alive. A really, really derpy urban legend. A middle would be something along the lines of what is traditionally called a conspiracy theory, like 9/11 was an inside job. And then high would be something that actually exists as a dispute in the zeitgeist, like irreversible climate change is man-made. These are all thumb-down descriptive claims that are either true or false. But the commonality between all these things is that they are not immediately observable to the senses. In that the generic person who is trying to wrestle with these questions has never seen Elvis Presley's body, was not present when the Twin Towers fell, and are not climate scientists who have the necessary scientific credentials and skills to go through the scientific literature about what the actual nature of climate change is. Whether it is or is not real. And I'm not claiming that it is or is not real. I'm just citing these as examples. But the asinine examples of things like the status of Elvis Presley being alive or dead, or the status of Paul McCartney being alive or dead, despite how stupid they are, these are incredibly important examples because, like I said, the form scales.
One response to saying Elvis is still alive is to say, for example, well, you don't know with epistemic certainty whether he is, so therefore you shouldn't say that he's still alive unless you know that he's still alive, to which the response to that would be, of course, the same thing. You don't know it either, so now we're at odds. And for the person who is initiating the claim that Elvis is still alive, being at odds is a victory. Elvis is still alive. No, he's not. You don't know that. This was a conspiracy. No, it wasn't. You don't know that. This catastrophe is man-made. No, it's not. You don't know that.
Or even if it's in rebuttal to the positive statement.
The positive statement? What do you mean by the positive statement?
Someone who's trying to assert a claim. So, for example,
Elvis is not alive. Yes, he is.
I want a better thumb-down example. This is something that also came up in the zeitgeist. The world is round and not flat. Response. You don't know that.
Okay.
Neil Armstrong actually walked on the moon. Response. You don't know that. It might have been a fake. It might have been a hoax. That was another thing that was circulating YouTube a couple years ago.
Provisional positions seem to be an alternative to the epistemic card, as we were starting to lay out here, which would indicate, rather than responding to someone that says Elvis is still alive, to say you don't know whether he is alive because you can't prove it, that a better response to someone claiming Elvis is still alive is to say, if Elvis was still alive, then what would you do? What would your position be? Would it change anything? Let's grant that your claim is true. How does that affect the decisions that you would otherwise make? Because if it affects nothing, then the entire discussion fizzles under decomposing the epistemic question, because it's just trolling epistemology. The only thing that's keeping it alive is the epistemic question. Is that the case for all these things? I don't know how you develop a provisional position around the question of whether Elvis is or is not still alive. Is that the task at hand? Do you need a provisional position for any of these thumb-down examples? I agree that they are appeals to the response, which is you don't know that, in order to actually gain any traction, and that can create a very problematic device, and that people use that device very strategically under the category of the epistemic card itself. And they play the epistemic card and say you don't know that in order to either justify their claim or to try to reject someone else's claim. Sure. Maybe their provisional position doesn't matter as much as mine. So the response to someone telling me Elvis is still alive would be, if Elvis was still alive, it wouldn't affect me.
That's certainly an option that does come out. But where this magic TV problem or this appeal to epistemic uncertainty comes in is there's either A, some kind of decision that needs to be made, or B, some kind of position that needs to be formed. I think back to the beginning of the Cold War and the historical examples of things like the early days of CPUSA, which is the Communist Party of the United States. And during the early days of the labor movement in the late 20s, early 30s, where there was a lot of Soviet involvement in the American labor movement during that time, this is when things like the Stalinist purges were going on. And this was before the esteemed Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote his book, The Gulag Archipelago, documenting what the horrors of the Stalinist purges actually were. Solzhenitsyn was not the first one to have these reports coming out of the Soviet Union at the time. There were others before him, obviously. He was the one who sort of blew the lid off of everything. That's what makes his work so momentous. But I'm thinking back to that time when these early reports of things like Holodomor were going on in the Soviet Union and other details pertaining to the Stalinist purges. And this information would slowly leak out to the United States. And people were saying, oh, these are lies. This is propaganda. This is just not true. Even though they didn't use this term back in those days, it was their version of fake news, fake news, fake news. It's not real, it's fake news, therefore you can just disregard it off the bat. It is very easy to envision a generic individual in the States saying, there are millions of people getting slaughtered in Stalinist gulags in the Soviet Union. And some CPUSA member looking at that generic individual and saying, you don't know that. You haven't been to the Soviet Union. You don't know. It's the workers' paradise. All right, well, what if there are Stalinist gulags? What then? What's the conclusion if there are? Is it still a problem, or is it justified for some other reason? But the legwork for what the conclusions ought to be once you get the proverbial tuning fork is already done. That's how this scales. That's the example of having to come to a position on a question. And then it gets really even scarier when actual decisions have to be made. How about the following proposition? X medication is safe for human consumption. X medication is unsafe. Well, you don't know that. Or the opposite. It's safe. You don't know that. You have a decision to make. Are you going to take the medication or not? For those of you listening at home, I would highly recommend a podcast entitled The Portal with Eric Weinstein, specifically the episode where he interviews his brother Brett, and Brett talks about his story about how he functionally got railroaded in university for his research on lab mice telomeres and the implications of abnormally long telomeres on drug safety testing, for a very, very eye-opening episode on how the thumb on a question like this comes down really fast and really hard. You have a decision to make. Are you going to take the medical product or not?
So there's work to be done with the question of what your position would be if the conditions are predefined, which is a hypothetical situation. Like you were saying, the work is already done. For once you have the observable anchor for the point of reference, you know how to proceed because of that work. You're not surprised once the Soviets are revealed to have been committing the, I'm going to say, atrocities that they have. And I'm referring to this in the context of what you were describing, which was, for example, saying slaughter, for example, saying atrocities, and then the response being, well, you don't know that there's slaughter, you don't know that there's atrocities. What the provisional position is trying to account for is the situation where, if and when the slaughter and the atrocities are the anchor point of reference because they did happen, you don't get to be surprised by this information. You don't get to ask the question, well, what do we do now? It's like, well, you could have already asked that question. And even to your description of trying to get underneath the analysis of a situation where you're trying to understand whether the person that you're speaking with considers these actions a kind of necessity or a kind of atrocity. The provisional position reveals whether someone is saying that these atrocities should never happen, or that, what would the provisional position be? The phrasing that we would use is something like, what's one more body on the way to utopia? Something like that. Just as a point of contrast. And that provisional position is somewhat extensive. I see it much more often than I wish I ever would.
The epistemic card or the provisional position?
Well, the thing is, someone who's trying to defend atrocities is not exactly forward about their provisional positions. Usually they're going to try to hide their provisional positions behind the epistemic card. Because, well, frankly, their provisional positions are unacceptable. So what I'm referring to is something that I would encounter is the presence of an unacceptable provisional position that someone's trying to hide behind the epistemic card that gets exposed once that strategy of trying to reject the position by saying you don't know, once that strategy is ineffective, once it's dissolved, then there's nothing left except for the actual provisional position or the fact that they don't have one, which means that they haven't put the work into actually understanding what principles that they're trying to operate under. What definitions are we lacking?
We are still lacking the thumb-down definition of provisional position. I've already provided the thought experiment of what the magic TV problem is. And we have a definition of epistemic card that we have regulated as temporary, but it seems to be that we're not coming up with anything that can overturn it. Once we get a thumb-down, tangible definition of the term provisional position, it'd be nice to have one or two thumb-down examples of what that looks like for the sake of the audience sitting at home.
Something that we haven't really addressed directly is the situation that a provisional position provides, which is the ability to confront an individual who is making a claim with the question as to what their provisional position would be if the opposite of their claim was true. So to be able to ask the person who's saying Elvis is still alive, rather than to say you don't know if Elvis is still alive or not, to say, for example, if Elvis was dead, what would you do?
Or what would you assert?
What would your position be? And that contrast is very helpful to also be able to look at, well, why are you saying that Elvis is alive? What difference does it make? Because this has more to do with what you can and cannot understand with epistemic certainty. And when you ask about the opposite claim, what it does is it reveals the principles that are required to make the first claim. So does that mean that if Elvis is still alive, that it's possible to cheat death and that immortality is worth pursuing? If Elvis is still alive, does it mean that you get to go to a concert? If Elvis is still alive, then you get to hear new recordings or songs? What does it mean? But what does it mean as compared to what the position would be of that same individual if Elvis was not still alive? Because I'm assuming the position of this individual, if Elvis was not still alive, assuming that they are willing to consider it, just assuming that they have a provisional position at all, is to say, well, that would be consistent with the way that life seems to work, or that would be consistent with biology, that would be consistent with these other claims like mortals die, so nothing would really change because everything is as it otherwise would be. Okay, so then if it's not that, then what's different than what it otherwise would be? It points to other principles that are relevant to the claim outside of what is or is not known in terms of epistemic certainty.
To pile onto that as well, The power of the provisional position is that it allows the individual to pivot the discourse into the realm of normative claims. And the epistemic card doesn't really work on normative claims.
Right, because then you can say, should this be the case? Should it be the case that Elvis is still alive, or should it be the case that he's not? And if you're trying to say that immortality is possible, then maybe it's better to say that Elvis ought not still be alive. Is that the direction that you're going?
Kind of. What happens when you do that, when that shift goes into the normative realm, suddenly the Magic TV problem is no longer a problem, because inherent in the idea of normative claims, they can be true or false, but they're immediately tangible. You don't need to consult anything else in order to determine whether or not a normative claim is true or false. The information is provided within the terms of the claim itself. You then start linking it to other claims, and that shift into the normative space that provisional positions provide is the ticket to the way the bull does his work as opposed to the tiger.
When you say that this is the way that the bull operates rather than the tiger, are you referring to the ability for the bull to pin down the individual into proceeding with the discussion because snapping the coat with the epistemic card is not effective? Is that what you're referring to?
Correct.
That escape strategy is accounted for.
Correct.
Well, that means that a provisional position would have to grant something then in order to proceed.
The provisional position is a linking mechanism. It links something to the thing that is granted. Fine, we'll grant X, but you're not going to be able to do away with Y. What it does is that, like with relative pitch, it binds a series of different claims together as a single set, which means that when you have this binding, and whether or not the anchor point, the given, becomes true or false, it either moves or takes the entire system with it or affirms the entire system. What happens then by binding these claims together, what you create is a situation where you can affirm the epistemic certainty of a variety of different claims by being able to pin down the truth value of one. Because you can guarantee the interrelationships between the claims without having to appeal to epistemic certainty. If note number 1 is C, then note number 2 is definitely G, because I can guarantee that the distance between these two notes is a perfect fifth. Now, if it turns out that it's not C and the note is actually F, then fine, then the second note is C. Or F sharp, then go up to C sharp. It doesn't matter, but no matter what happens, the distance between these two things is a perfect fifth, and that does not change. And I don't need to appeal to a tuning fork or perfect pitch in order to make the determination of the distance relationship between these two notes. In the same way, what the provisional position does, like with relative pitch, is that it binds a variety of different claims together into a single web.
Okay. This can also be organized into the request for a provisional position, which, for example, can come from one of two places, depending on who's making the claim or who's making the request for the provisional position. So, for example, you can have someone saying, Elvis is still alive, and then someone saying, you don't know that. And then the response being, well, if Elvis was still alive, what would you do? It doesn't matter if I know it or not. And then the other version of that would be, Elvis is alive. No, he's not. You don't know that. If Elvis was dead, then what would you do? The provisional position question trying to overturn the epistemic card. It seems a provisional position would have more utility than just overturning an epistemic card, but all of these examples require an epistemic card that needs to be overturned. Perhaps it's just proper to refer to a provisional position as a response to the epistemic card. It's an inquiry to say, what is the answer to this question? And that question is a response to the problem of the epistemic card in order to overturn it.
Probably. That seems more like a description than a definition, though.
I'm asking if this is accurate in terms of requiring an epistemic card in the definition.
I think so. Because here's the thing. Epistemic card, definitely. You can even have a provisional position on an epistemic problem. Let's say that you are facing a situation in which the epistemic uncertainty is actually legitimate. In that situation, sure, it is also legitimate to have a provisional position. But the commonality is that the provisional position is always trying to account for some kind of epistemic uncertainty. Whether or not the epistemic uncertainty is justified or unjustified, proper or improper, is a separate question.
Okay.
But in the situation where epistemic uncertainty is not even a point of concern, then there is no purpose for a provisional position because there's nothing to be provisional about. You can just have the position.
So it's a method to proceed in the face of epistemic uncertainty, which entails what would be the next step of that, right?
Characterized by X.
Do you want to keep that phrasing? A method to proceed in the face of epistemic uncertainty characterized by X?
Yeah.
So then it's characterized by the description of if this was the situation, then what would you do? So the question would be, how do you make a definition out of that description?
A method to proceed in the face of epistemic uncertainty characterized by the binding of one or more claims to a single given.
So what's the given in this example?
You need a example, or is there a specific example we had on hand already? I recommend we take an example straight out of any Philosophy 101 textbook. Both modus tollens and modus ponens are partial examples of provisional positions. Now, for the sake of our audience at home, modus ponens and modus tollens is academic philosophy jargon for a specific sequence of argument. And in condensed form, it goes, if A, then B, A, therefore B, and then if A, then B, not B, therefore not A. And the stereotypical flushed out formulation of modus ponens would be premise 1, if Fido is a dog, then Fido is a mammal. Premise 2, Fido is a dog, therefore conclusion, Fido is a mammal. Now, just a moment ago, I said partial because both modus ponens and modus tollens technically leave the realm of provisional positions because of their premise 2. Because premise 2 comes down on the freestanding claim that declares Fido is indeed a dog. Maybe it would be best to describe a provisional position as some variant of modus ponens or modus tollens in which the premise 2 is yet to come into place, because depending on whether you're dealing with modus ponens or modus tollens, you're either dealing with an affirmation or a denial. However, the point I want to drive home is that premise 1 of both modus ponens and modus tollens is an example of two claims being bound together. Perhaps we need to adjust the term inside a single given, but the idea being that the entire structure of the argument for both modus ponens and modus tollens hinges upon the connection of if Fido is a dog, then Fido is a mammal. Because Fido is a dog and Fido is a mammal are two independent freestanding claims that can be affirmed or denied on their own terms. But what the if-then statement does is that it takes these two things and binds them together. This binding of at least two claims is essential in the characterization of a provisional position.
So premise 1 would be if A, then B.
Correct.
Where in the equation do you place epistemic certainty?
Premise 2. If we're using modus ponens and modus tollens as examples, epistemic certainty would be placed on premise 2.
So you don't need epistemic certainty for premise 1.
Correct. And that is part of the pathology of the epistemic card, is that a lot of individuals who try to play the epistemic card mistakenly believe that by rejecting premise 2, they are actually undermining the validity of premise 1. But that doesn't work. Just because you can demonstrate that Fido is indeed not a dog, that does not automatically mean, then, that you have demonstrated that there is therefore no relationship whatsoever between dogs and mammals. If Fido is a dog, then Fido is a mammal. You don't know that. Excuse me?
I don't have to know that, would be the response to that.
Exactly. the information pertaining to premise 1 is always inherent on its face.
Premise 1 is also the same for both formats. So if A, then B, A, therefore B. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. If A, then B is the same for both.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what leads to saying it doesn't matter if we have A or not B. We can still establish if A, then B.
Correct.
These are all directly in the same format as the examples that we were referring to. If Elvis is alive, then what would your position be? If Elvis was not alive, then what would your position be? You can bind claims considering that particulars can be connected, and the connections of those particulars are connected as well. It seems what you want to do with the definition is to say, if the single given A, then B, potentially given A, then B, C, X, Y, as many variables as required.
This is where the allegory of relative pitch starts coming into play. Is that when you are able to establish that you can bind and link various claims together into a sequential chain, regardless of whether or not you actually have the initial anchor point, you can still create the chain. And then wherever you anchor down the chain on the keyboard, the rest of the chain follows.
Well, it is a way to proceed through the discussion, particularly just because you don't know exactly what notes to play on the piano. That doesn't mean that there's no work to be done to understand the theory and the relationships and how it works. So that when you do know the notes that you need to, you can understand what it is that you're trying to do in the first place or why. So we have a sequence of events where we have some kind of epistemic uncertainty, and then there needs to be a way to proceed in the face of that epistemic uncertainty. And one such method to proceed in the face of that epistemic uncertainty is to say somehow, well, it doesn't really matter whether I do or do not have epistemic certainty, because I can still put the work into saying, if this, then that, and then I can figure out if this is the case, and then I have a way to proceed.
Right. So perhaps if I go back and I adjust the definition that we have, we can try playing with this. A provisional position is a method to proceed in the face of epistemic uncertainty, characterized by the binding of one or more claims to a single causal sequence, temporarily forgoing the need to affirm the initial premise. It's basically a description of building out your premise 1 of either a modus ponens or a modus tollens. And then the minute premise 2 of either one of those sequences comes in, either yes, A, or no, not B, that's when it leaves the provisional. So a sort of contracted definition of a provisional position could be either a modus ponens or a modus tollens with premise number 2 temporarily missing.
Essentially, when looking at the statement, if A, then B, what the provisional position is pointing at is saying that there exist circumstances where if A, then B, A, therefore B, for example, is very useful and very powerful, but there are situations where merely establishing if A, then B at all is sufficient. The objective is to establish if A, then B. That's enough. And that's difficult enough to accomplish. If you can establish if A, then B, then good job. You don't need to actually proceed. At least insofar as the position is provisional, under the definition that we're trying to articulate. Doesn't quite work as well as I would like it to.
What are you pointing to? The definition? Elaborate, I don't quite follow.
Well, I was just looking at the situation where if A, then B, and if A, then B, then great, because that's the work that needs to be done despite knowing whether the circumstances are such that you have A or you have not B.
Yes. So what's giving you pause?
So if A, then B, if A, you can establish premise 1, then B, that's sufficient for a provisional position.
Yes. I'm having a hard time following what's giving you pause.
Well, the epistemic certainty applies to premise 2.
Yes.
Which means that under a provisional position, I don't need epistemic certainty.
Yes.
It doesn't matter if I have A or not B.
Mm-hmm. This all sounds good to me. I'm still not seeing where the problem is.
Would you say if premise 1 can be established, then the provisional position is sufficient?
By sufficient, you mean that
the definition of the provisional position is satisfied?
I'd say so, yes. Because the entire point of provisional position is that you cannot settle upon premise 2 of either modus ponens or modus tollens.
All you have is modus.
Yeah.
So that means, for example, premise 1 can be established, therefore the provisional position is sufficient by the definition of provisional position.
I want to tweak that a little bit, because sufficient for what? Would it be accurate if I reformulate what you're saying as if premise 1 of either modus ponens or modus tollens can be established, therefore what is present sufficiently qualifies as a provisional position? Is that accurate? I just want to make sure that we're really clear, because I don't want to leave any dangling bits. Because if you end the sentence with the word sufficient, it leaves room for the skeptic to proclaim sufficient for what? Because we're talking about the existence of a provisional position being established. Yes, this is a provisional position. You've got premise 1. Good job. You have a provisional position. If that's what you're saying, then sure.
So if premise 1 can be established, then you have a provisional position?
Yes.
So then premise 1 can be established, therefore you have a provisional position?
Correct.
The definition of premise 1 being if A then B, or if this then that.
Mm-hmm.
So I therefore have a provisional position about having a provisional position.
What does that look like? Can you state it?
So premise 1, if A then B.
Mm-hmm.
I'm using the A of if A then B to say A equals premise 1 can be established.
I see. So let me see if I can reword it. Tell me if this is an accurate representation of what you just said. If I can establish an if-then statement, then I have a provisional position. Hence, I have a provisional position about a provisional position.
Yes.
Okay. Then yes.
If I can establish an if-then statement,
Then
I have a provisional position.
Therefore,
I have a provisional position.
Correct. Yes, that's how it feeds back into itself. Going back to our previous episode about self-referential coherency, that is self-referentially coherent. And then turning that into a non-provisional position is for premise 2 to come out and say, I can establish an if-then statement. Therefore,
then I have a provisional position. But that is your position of having a provisional position.
Right, okay.
So
it still works.
It does.
This is now my position on provisional positions.
Well, right, but that's what I was saying about switching it into also the not formulation, where if I do not have a provisional position, then I do not have an if-then statement. I cannot create a provisional position. Therefore, I cannot have an if-then statement. And that is my position, to say that I do not have a provisional position. I cannot create an if-then statement.
Mm.
So it still brings it out of provisional
into an actual
to establish
position.
whether you can create the if-then statement.
So, for the sake of our audience sitting at home, as we're tumbling around in this very, very thumb-up land, I want to, at this point, take the opportunity to very purposely throw our audience a bone by bringing the thumb down on this. Let's go back to the Philosophy 101 example of Fido being a dog, and the reason why pinning down the definition of provisional position is so important. What this looks like when you bring the thumb down is something that seems so asinine and so simple on its face, yet is a function that people always tend to forget when it's applied to anything other than examples that are as asinine as Fido being the dog. And it's simply this. Establishing whether dogs belong to mammals, or what is the relationship between dogs and mammals, is completely independent of whether or not Fido is or is not actually a dog. Establishing the proper relationship between dogs and mammals is in itself already an extensive amount of work. We as modern human beings, already on the coattails of long-established taxonomical science, look at the classification of mammals as being incredibly simplistic. But in the realm of philosophy, we use these incredibly simplistic examples to demonstrate the meta behind these points so that we can grab hold to these meta points and then apply them with equal certainty and equal confidence to other examples. Establishing what constituted a mammal was not always obvious. Somebody had to put in that work. All right, well, we have all these animals. How are we going to bring the Persic knife down on all these animals? Okay, well, why don't we have this thing called mammals? All right, well, how are we going to bring the definition of mammals into something that is articulatable? How do we articulate the meaning of mammals? All right, well, what about this thing? What about whales? What about dolphins? I mean, are whales and dolphins in the same classification as dogs and cats? I mean, I don't know. I mean, we have these things on land and these other things are in the ocean, but we're going to say these things are related. We're going to say that there's a closer relationship between a dolphin and a dog than there is between a dolphin and a fish. Somebody had to put this footwork in. And although we as modern human beings benefit with modern science textbooks in 10th grade biology class, there exists a wide variety, a wide list of thumb-down examples in which establishing the taxonomy of ideas is not obvious. And that's a lot of work to establish the if-then statement. And that's not work that is subject to getting derailed by the epistemic card. Establishing the taxonomy of ideas is not something that is subject to the asinine retort of, oh, you don't know that. Oh, but this news report said this. Well, that news report said that. Who cares? That's not what we're doing here. We can still figure out something in the face of the magic television. When the magic television is showing us completely different images, we can still cross-reference something for commonality. The provisional position is what allows us to establish a consensus on reality while being stuck in an isolation chamber in which we do not have access to epistemic certainty. Epistemic uncertainty doesn't collapse entirely the human ability to establish anything. There's still a lot that we can do. That's again what gives rise to relative pitch. Here's a guitar that's completely out of whack. You have no access to any tuning fork. You don't have perfect pitch. You don't know what the strings are or what they're supposed to be tuned to. Does that mean that your ability to play guitar is completely gone? And you can do nothing? Oh, well, no tuning fork, no piano, nobody has perfect pitch, so I guess that means that we can't do anything with this guitar. No, you can still figure out the relationships between the strings. In the same way that you can still figure out the relationships between the strings, you can still figure out the relationships between ideas.
But Chingachgook, if it's not A440, then it's a lie.
That's basically what the epistemic card boils down to, if we were to translate the epistemic card into the realm of the music allegory. If A is not 440, then it's a lie. That is a perfect encapsulation of the pathology of the epistemic card.
Especially to say there's no work to be done until A is 440.
Yeah. Another allegory that I had on hand is the allegory of how a blind person navigates his house, or how you can navigate a dark room. You don't know with epistemic certainty what's where. You can't see where things are. Everything's dark, but you can measure your steps. You can measure and establish the distance between things. If you know your house, then you can establish where the front door is. Then you can establish where everything else is without having to see it. Is it better than being actually able to see it? Is having no tuning fork better than having a tuning fork? Of course not. Of course not. If you have the awesome, brand new, super fancy Jetsons tuner that can tune anything in any environment to any subtone that you want, of course that's better. Of course that's nice. But if you don't have it, that doesn't mean that you can do nothing. The problem is that we are living through an era in which there are forces in this world that are carrying out very vicious attacks on the metaphorical tuning forks, on the ability to establish what is epistemically certain. Human society has become so advanced and so specialized that it is now no longer possible for one person to get their hands around all things necessary in order to make modern life work. One mind can't contain all that information. We have to be able to outsource. Now, what is or is not medically safe, what is or is not safe for consumption, what is or is not safe for whatever. One person cannot have all the answers because nobody can be an expert in all the relevant points. We have to be able to defer to quote unquote experts in order to allow modern human society to function. It didn't used to be that way. Prior to the scientific revolution, one person could understand all the relevant information that there was available to know because the pool of information was so limited. That's the reason why people like Aristotle could be know-it-alls. Aristotle could have access to all of human information that was available because in his era, it was so much more circumspect than what it is compared to now. But like with what Aristotle and Plato did, epistemic uncertainty is not the death knell to establish anything. No epistemic certainty, therefore you can't know anything. No, sorry, that's wrong too. Totally wrong. There is still value in thinking for yourself, and there are still tangible ideas to grasp onto, even in the face of epistemic uncertainty. You can tune the guitar strings against each other with relative pitch. You can bind various statements together. And then when the time comes where you can take your main anchor and wherever you have to drop anchor, then so be it. It's fine. At least the chain is already established. And that's also a really good segue into the idea of entailed statements, which is something else that comes straight out of Philosophy 101. Going back to the asinine example of Fido the dog. If you proclaim that Fido is a dog, you have simultaneously proclaimed that Fido is a mammal. You don't get to separate those things. If somebody says to you, I just said that Fido is a dog, I never proclaimed that Fido is a mammal, don't put words into my mouth. That's pathological. And you, the audience, need to be able to identify and understand why that is pathological. These monkeys of the world will attempt to prevent you from holding them to the entailments of their statements, and it doesn't work. The monkeys of the world don't even realize the entailments of their own statements the majority of the time. They just make claims, and then when you say, okay, well, if you claim that, then this is what logically must necessarily follow from your claim, they'll attempt to say no, and then you'll try to say, well, hang on, monkey. Given what you just said, this is what follows. Monkey, if you proclaim that Fido is a dog, inherent in the definition of dog is mammal. It is impossible for Fido to be a dog and not be a mammal at the same time. And the monkey will say, you don't know that. The epistemic card doesn't work on premise 1. It only works on premise 2. Because if you try to say, if Fido is a dog, then Fido is a mammal, and the monkey says, you don't know that, the appropriate response is, yes, I do. The information is available on its face. The definition of mammal is X, the definition of dog is Y. X subsumes Y. We don't need to appeal to authority. We don't need to appeal to alternative news sources. We don't need to appeal to anything a posteriori. It's already established. And even if Fido comes out and he has scales and a flicky tongue, it doesn't matter. Because the key point is being able to establish premise 1. Fido turning out to be a snake has zero effect on the relationship between dogs and mammals.
If the creature is a dog, then the creature is also a mammal.
Correct. And establishing that is something that does not require appeals to epistemology, because the information in the definitions of the terms are available to everyone. How do you define dog? How do you define mammal?
Establishing a provisional position in terms of establishing the if-then statement is also incredibly useful, because then it creates the material that's after then. Before you have the complete if-then statement, you don't have access to what it is that you're trying to bind to that which is given. If you have the ability to bind a claim with a single causal given, that can also be very revealing in terms of the intention and the direction that the discussion takes. Essentially saying, if your premise is granted, then what are the implications? What I'm wondering is whether this works properly for the causal given to be the statement that the bull grants.
It can be.
If this is a means to granting a premise so as to properly establish the bullhorns.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be. It can do more than that. Do we need to return to Elvis at all?
I don't think so.
All right.
I think Fido has more utility than Elvis.
Okay.
So that being said, is there anything, do you think, that we need to amend with our current definition of provisional position? Or is it good as it stands?
It's essentially pointing at the value of if-then statements. If you get rid of if-then statements, then bad. The binding of one or more claims to a single causal given in sequence and without the need to affirm what?
The initial premise.
What's the initial premise?
So that would be the if clause of premise 1 of modus ponens or modus tollens.
I see.
If Fido is a dog,
Okay.
then Fido is a mammal. What the provisional position does is it allows you to bind dogs and mammals without having to affirm what follows behind if, in this case being Fido is a dog. That is squarely the function of premise 2.
Right, which is to say, if Fido is a dog, then Fido is a mammal. It doesn't matter if Fido is or is not a dog.
Correct.
I can still say if Fido is a dog, then Fido is a mammal without establishing whether Fido is a dog.
Because it is a commentary on the relationship between dogs and mammals, not Fido directly. Fido's status doesn't affect premise 1.
Fido's status doesn't affect what falls after if.
Correct.
So why wouldn't initial premise be a single causal given without having to affirm the single causal given?
A method to proceed in the face of epistemic uncertainty characterized by the binding of one or more claims to a single causal sequence, temporarily forgoing the need to affirm the single causal given.
Well, it's whatever you're binding the claims to.
The antecedent? We shouldn't have to be reinventing the wheel on this. Philosophy 101 has already done this work. The two portions of a if-then statement have names already. The if portion has a name, the then portion has a name. The if portion is the antecedent, the then portion is the consequent. So then, for our definition of provisional position, a method to proceed in the face of epistemic uncertainty characterized by the binding of one or more claims to a single causal sequence, temporarily forgoing the need to affirm the antecedent. Is there anything we need to change about this definition?
It can be improved on, but I think that it works for now. It's a little bit redundant at times, but
It meets the threshold of function. So, just to reiterate, a provisional position is a method to proceed in the face of epistemic uncertainty characterized by the binding of one or more claims to a single causal sequence, temporarily forgoing the need to affirm the antecedent.
the antecedent of that sequence being the cause of the causal sequence. You don't need to affirm the cause of the causal sequence. It doesn't matter if the cause does exist immediately. It's temporarily forgoed. You need to get to it eventually, but that's when you have, like we were saying, a position rather than a provisional position.
Correct.
Which is also essentially to say, if an individual tries to play the epistemic card, then that's when the if-then statements come out.
Yes.
Just as a direct response. If it matters so much that I have a degree of certainty of what I do or do not know, then we can still put work into this discussion, even granting that I do or do not know. We can temporarily forgo whether I do or do not know, and there's still work to be done.
And as further commentary, these provisional positions, these if-then statements, are incredibly powerful when they're normative. That's when they become forces of nature. Oh, you just need to understand that this group of people, or this country, or this whatever, this person, this entity is trying to do this, and so we just need to be able to excuse their behavior because this is what they're trying to do. Okay, pause. If this person, this group, this country, these people, this X, whatever the entity is trying to accomplish this thing, should they be doing that? If X is trying to accomplish Y, then they should be doing Z. Try playing an epistemic card on that.
If this, then the proper way to proceed is that.
Correct.
Committing to those statements also gives someone the opportunity to demonstrate that they are in fact doing what they proclaim to be proper, which is also good to be able to observe, but reiterates the fact that the entailments of the statements hold. Don't just do away with if-then statements. They're not just powerful, they're very productive. It's great for something to be productive and powerful, especially if you're having a discussion with someone that is more concerned with power than being productive. Practice takes work. Just because the instrument's tuned to itself doesn't mean that you can't practice. Put the work in. The mechanism is there, but you still have to understand how to use it. And when you fail, you can update. No need to deny. Just update. Replace it with something better. Generate the alternatives.
So just as a point of review, the epistemic card is a pathological form of rebuttal that seeks to reject a given proposition by appealing to uncertainty regarding descriptive claims. And a provisional position is a method to proceed in the face of epistemic uncertainty characterized by the binding of one or more claims to a single causal sequence, temporarily forgoing the need to affirm the antecedent of that sequence. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Garrote. So, until next time, Vidorio Esperante. Keep breathing, everyone.